Will you pray with me? May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable to you, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Amen. The women went out and fled from the tomb, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. It's a good thing the Easter story does not end with Mark's gospel. It's a good thing the Easter story doesn't end with Mark's gospel, first and foremost because it would ruin our Easter hymn. Can you imagine if Mark's gospel was all we had to work with? The hymn we sang this morning would sound more like, Jesus Christ is risen today, hallelujah. We're so scared we ran away, hallelujah. Found the tomb, his body's gone, hallelujah. Let's tell no one and move on, hallelujah. It's a good thing the Easter story doesn't end with Mark's gospel. And in fact, if you were following along in your pew Bible, you will see two alternate endings to Mark, a shorter ending and a longer ending. These are not original to the manuscript, right? They were written by early Christian scribes, tasked with making copies of Mark's gospel, who got to the end of the scroll and said, that's it. That's a terrible ending. We know how this story goes, and we can do better. So they filled in the blanks. It's a good thing the Easter story doesn't end with Mark's gospel, and to be sure, it doesn't end with Mark, right? There are three other later gospel traditions, and they give us what is glaringly absent from Mark, a resurrected Jesus. Jesus appears in the upper room with his disciples, speaks words of peace to them, shows them his wounds. In John's gospel, Jesus calls Mary by name and she recognizes him. And then later he holds a fish fry on the beach with Peter, James, and John. In Matthew, Jesus takes all the disciples up on a high mountain and he gives them the Great Commission, go and make disciples of all nations. In Luke, we even get to watch, not once but twice, as Christ is lifted up into heaven, from whence he shall return. Yes, it's a good thing that the Easter story doesn't end with Mark's gospel, because we who live in this world are daily confronted with scenes of crucifixion, violence, oppression, hate, injustice. And we need these stories of the risen Christ to remind us that impossible, unbelievable grace is also present and at work in the world around us. It's a good thing the Easter story does not end with Mark, but at the same time, I'm glad that we have Mark. I'm grateful that the good news of Jesus Christ includes this story of scared and speechless women running from the tomb. Sometimes I actually find it reassuring to hear this account of an incomplete, fits and starts, only just beginning, not yet ready for prime time resurrection. For one thing, it sounds a whole lot more like real life, doesn't it? Maybe once, or if we're lucky, twice in our lives, we'll feel as triumphant as Easter lilies and trumpets, but most of the time, resurrection looks and feels much more tentative, unsure, dubious. We wake up after surgery and the doctor says, we believe we got all the cancer. We'll see what the reports say. A loved one from whom we've been estranged calls and says, "I don't know how to make it right, but I want to try." We say out loud, "I want to get clean and sober," but we're painfully aware that today is only day one. The angels proclaim, "Christ is risen, he is risen indeed," but all we see in front of us is an empty tomb. Mark's ending is chaotic and confusing. He gives us fear, silence, and an empty tomb. Mark's story does not end with happily ever after. One could argue it does not really end at all. But I'm glad we have Mark's gospel, because Mark reminds us that an empty tomb might just be enough. All we've got this morning is an empty tomb, so friends, let's rest in it for a minute. Where are those places in our lives in need of resurrection, of hope? Or where do we feel like we're supposed to trust in the promise of life, but we're afraid to admit that sometimes it looks like death may be winning? Are there places in our lives or in the world where we sense that something might be changing, where we're witnessing just a little bit of tentative, incomplete resurrection? But we're afraid to let ourselves hope, because hope is such a vulnerable place to be. Friends, when we do experience these hints of resurrection, I want to encourage us to take comfort in the empty tomb. The empty tomb gives us somewhere to sit and simply not get it, to feel scared, traumatized, or confused, to hold incongruent truths and impossible realities. We saw Jesus crucified. We saw where they laid his body, but he is not here. We don't know what that means. Death did not go as expected. We hear the news. We get the diagnosis. The tragedy washes over us, and we know that we will never be okay again, and yet, here we are, somehow, confused, motley, messy people, but Easter people nonetheless. Friends, could it be that this, too, is resurrection? Perhaps this is the good news that Mark wants us to hear, that we can trust in the promise of resurrection, even when all we have is an empty tomb. That we can know that Christ is risen, that love is stronger than death, even when we see only the faintest glimmer of hope. That even when we are terrified, even when we turn and flee, God is still there, still unapologetically present with us, still working out this great mystery of faith right here, right now. Mark leaves us with an empty tomb, but we know that's not how the story ends. The women don't stay silent forever. Somehow the story does get out. Otherwise, we wouldn't be gathered here millennia later as the church, reading it today. We get to the end, and Mark says, "Come, sit in the empty tomb. Stay as long as you like. But you know as well as I do that this is not the end. So after you've paused here and taken some time, get up, finish the story. You step in where the women leave off. Go and practice resurrection. They said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Mark's story ends with fear. I wonder if that's because he wants us to hear the angel's message. Be not afraid. Mark's story ends with silence. I wonder if that's because Mark is inviting us to speak. Mark's story of resurrection is partial, incomplete, and maybe that's because the story isn't over. Not yet. Christ is risen. He is risen indeed. The tomb is empty. God is alive and at work in the world. Now, what are we going to do about it?